to invite you to this next session of the PRB Biodiversity community. Before getting into this session, let me remind you that the community is an interactive platform for you to exchange with experts and your peers. So we highly encourage you to participate in the discussion and engage with today's excellent speakers. We'll pause for question and answer for each session at the end. If you want to ask a question or interact with the speakers, please use the chat function. And when you want to ask a question, make sure you add your name, which institution you represent, and ideally also your role. Please keep your questions short and mention to whom they are addressed. Before giving the floor to our first speaker, let me take you through today's exciting agenda. We are thrilled to welcome Pavan Sukhdev, and I'll do a proper introduction in a minute, who will be providing us with the opening remarks. Following Pavan's remarks, we'll hear from Annabel Ross from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, who will explain to you why nature-related risks are material risks for the banking sector. And then we'll hear from Nathalie Borgeaud from the TNFD Secretariat, who leads the work on financial sector. Following these presentations, we'll have an energizing break from Vivek Menon, Executive Director for the Wildlife Trust of India. And then we'll conclude with a panel debate with Judson Berkley, Group Head Sustainability Engagement and Regulatory Strategy at UBS, Cristiano Oliveira, Sustainability Executive Manager at Suzano, and Nehru Pillay, General Manager for Research and Intelligence at Land and Agricultural Development Bank, or Land Bank, of South Africa. I will close the webinar by telling you a little bit more about UNEP-FI's approach to piloting the TNFD framework. Without further ado, let's move on to the opening remarks, and let me introduce to our special guest, Pavan Sukhdev. Pavan, it's an absolute honor to have you here with us today, and you are a pioneer in the field of biodiversity and economics, and you are one of the leading thinkers behind the idea of recognizing the economic value of nature services, or put simply, put a value on nature. In 2012, you led the groundbreaking The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or TEEB, reports, and since then you have won the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, often referred to as the Nobel Prize for Nature, together with Gretchen Daly from Stanford University. More recently, you served as president of WWF International, and we're glad that you had that role, because WWF is also part of the PRB Civil Society Advisory Body. Today, through your consulting firm GIS, you closely work with C-suite executives and senior government officials on transition techniques with an emphasis on metrics development. You are also a UNEP Goodwill Ambassador. And honestly, the list just goes on and on and on. But looking at your long career, one thing I want to highlight is that you worked for a long time as a banker in various senior roles, among others at Deutsche Bank. So for our participants who are joining from the banking sector, I think, Pavan is an excellent example of how you can use your banking skills to use. So Pavan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Romy, and greetings to all of you. It's a great privilege and an honor for me to be addressing my fellow bankers. And also it brings back a flood of memories. You're right, Romy, I spent almost 25 years in banking, 11 years at ANZ Bank and 14 years at Deutsche Bank. And I guess I still remain quite closely connected to the finance sector. The work on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity that I was privileged to lead as the TEEB project, as it's sometimes known, came out of earlier work that I had done for my NGO, GIST, which was on green accounting for Indian states. And it focused on the unrecognized values of nature. The fact that nature provided values, I think study after study has emphasized how important nature is for our society, our existence, and our economy. We are part of nature. We are one with nature. We do not appreciate the extent to which nature is the foundation of our economies. In our lack of appreciation and in the mesmerization with the magic of markets that seems to be typical of our society nowadays, we forget that these free, non-market goods and services are literally the foundation of our economies. And that is the economic invisibility that, in particular, the TEEB project tried to address at the policy level, at the business level, and of course, at the citizen individual level. So that is my background, and the role that I have with you today is to really stir the pot a little, to be able to frame the discussion on why should banks and financial institutions, and let me say it is about the financial institutions, the PRB. I really appreciate and thank the UNEP FI for putting in the effort to create the platform that we have today and the 300 odd members of the Principles of Responsible Banking. But also I thank the 70 who are in particular here today, which is the PRB for Biodiversity. We are at a juncture where we need to really reflect, because we are in a transition today between what is known as the traditional economy, the neoclassical economy, and the impact economy. And this great transition, as it's sometimes called, means also a change in the nature of capitalism, away from pure shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And the reason for that is that the impact economy obliges you to look at impacts, not just profits. Profits are also impacts. They are the financial impacts on the shareholder. But the shareholder is only one of the many stakeholders of the company. And please remember, corporations today are 2/3 of the economy, and jobs in the US, it's more like 74% and 75%. So you are talking about a huge part of today's economy and society. But the entire concept, the neoclassical economic concept of exchanges and only those things which are visible in markets and only those things should be given or ascribed value which have prices, means that we ignore a huge amount of public value that is delivered day after day by nature into our societies. And that means if we want the transition that we are speaking of, which we realize is necessary, we need to move from the world of produced capital only to the more complex, multidimensional world of produced natural, human, and social capital. And we need to stop measuring success at the national level using just GDP growth and start measuring it in terms of the inclusive wealth metrics, which are already produced for the last 10 years, now 2012 onwards. Literally for the last 10 years have been produced by the UN University United Nations Environment Programme. And that's at the macro level, but at the micro level, at the microeconomic level, also we need to look away from purely profits for shareholders as the only yardstick of success for a company. Because my friends, the reality is that it is also the human capital that you create for your employees and the natural capital that you either create or destroy, more likely, for your future generations, and the social capital which you engage and sometimes destroy, sometimes create. These elements of performance of human, natural, social, and produced capital are all part of the overall performance of a corporation. To think of a corporation today as purely a machine to make money for shareholders is a caricature of the corporation. This old Milton Friedman concept is history, and we can forget about it. The question is how to replace it. And that brings us onto the topic of today, which is how are we going to measure the value of a company, the performance of a company? How are we going to measure the likelihood of future value either increasing or decreasing by us, the financial sector? When we come to that question, we realize very quickly that the externalities of a corporation absolutely matter. It's not just about profits, it's about profits plus and minus positive and negative externalities. It matters because today's externalities are tomorrow's risks, and tomorrow's risks are day after tomorrow's losses. And if we are careless in selecting assets for our portfolio or selecting companies for our balance sheet, our lending balance sheet, if we are careless in our responsibilities, either as portfolio managers or as lending bankers, in what kind of company, with what kind of risk profile we accept, then I'm afraid that the consequences will be only ours to regret and to be responsible for. So the principles of responsible banking, which, by the way, do have a strong connection with also the other groups. So if we look at the principles for responsible banking and compare them with the principles for sustainable insurance and compare them again with the principles for responsible investment, we will find three themes which are in common. We will find that the concept of environmental and social impacts is there across all of them. We will find that collaboration is explicitly mentioned as a principle in all of them. And we will also find that disclosure is explicitly mentioned in all of these sets of principles. So whether we are an insurer or whether we are an investor or whether we are a banker, a lending banker, I'm afraid, my friends, we have to be collaborative, we have to disclose, and we have to incorporate environmental and social impacts if we are following the very principles to which we have all signed up. Finally, I'll say this about biodiversity. Biodiversity is the living fabric of this planet's surface, its ecosystems, its species, and its genes. All of this is literally life itself. The fact that we are part of it, the fact that we are one with it, sometimes gets forgotten due to the lens, the very specific lens of value equal to price that we follow because we are mesmerized by the magic of markets. We should not be. Valuation is a human institution. Eduardo Brondizio, who was one of the original authors of the TEEB reports, the TEEB chapter 4, I still remember, on valuation. He's also involved in the most recent IPBES study, which is called the Global Assessment on BES 2022, pointed this out very, very well, which is that valuation is much broader than just economic value. It is also about social value. It's also about intrinsic values. And we need to recognize that whole. In recognizing that whole, we also recognize that who values matters. Is it the local community? Is it the individual practitioner or business? Is it the government? Is it the visitor? The nature of valuation and the nature of value is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Not being able to recognize it, not being able to demonstrate it, and not being able to capture it sometimes through economic metrics and mechanisms is costing us our own lives and the lives of our future generations. All of us, therefore, have a collective responsibility to collaborate. And I think this is where the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure really makes an amazing contribution. It is a collaborative effort. I have been consulted and involved and have as many as hundreds of you have, I'm sure, been consulted and involved in this. It is a collaborative effort towards disclosure because it recognizes, as all of these principles for responsible banking, responsible investment, and sustainable insurance recognize, that disclosure is essential towards moving forward. We have to be able to measure and disclose to the public and to our stakeholders what are the impacts of the corporation and what are the impacts of our portfolios or our loan books, be it trading books or loan books. The same applies. So this is the direction that we have chosen, and I believe it is the right direction and honestly, the only direction. What is my regrets? My regrets are that we have taken too long. We have taken far too long because this conversation that I'm having with you today, my friends, is something that has been going on for 40 years. I would probably even say 50 years. That's not acceptable. We need to accelerate this. We need to make sure that the changes that we seek in terms of the disclosures, the regulations, are implemented aggressively and with speed, and that we do not delay any further, because to be honest, you don't have to look very far. Just look outside your window. Feel the heat. If you happen to be living in London, as I was a short while back, observe what is happening today. The tube isn't working because of the heat. A year ago at this time, it wasn't working because of the rains. We just don't have the time. We really have to get ourselves together and move forward and change whatever behaviors that are there amongst our clients and amongst our investees, so that we, be we as bankers, or we as investors, or we as insurers, we signal to them that the time has come for change. This great transition that I described to you is not theory. This is the essence of our lives. Yes, thank you to the 70 who are members of the PRB, and my encouragement to the remaining 230 who still are not. Please, there's nothing more valuable, nothing more important than nature itself. Ensuring that you are part of this network, collaboratively moving forward, and ensuring that the kind of lending, signals that you generate and the investment signals that you generate through your choices, through your monthly and annual reporting, and finally through your exits. Those signals have to be aligned with the direction of the future, which is a world in which people and humanity live in harmony. Collectively, this is our responsibility, and that's what all of you today are here to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pavan, and I think we can give you a virtual round of applause. This was such a wonderful start of our session today, and I think, we said that we wouldn't quote you, but I wish we didn't say that, because I would love to use the Milton Friedman is history quote, and I think also the concept that we need to move forward from a circular flow diagram focused of the economy. So that's great. Do you want to add something?
Well, I'm more than happy for you to quote me. I'm sorry I didn't write this up, but if you have a recording, by all means use it. So I stand by every word and sentence that I said.
Super, that's so great. And before we move on, I just want to ask you one question. And I think the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu said, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And I think it's great to speak about the big picture and where we want to be. But if you speak to, our audience today, which is nearly 130 representatives from global banks, what can they do differently tomorrow? What are the 2 cents to them that you would want them to start applying from tomorrow onwards?
If there is one thing that I request you, my friends, all 130 of you, is that we are moving from the neoclassical economy whose focus was profits to the new economy, the impact economy, whose focus is impacts. Please, you can't be part of that economy unless you measure impact. So start doing that right now. The whole of the TNFD is there to help you to do this. But by the way, apart from the TNFD, there's also the Natural Capital Protocol available to you. There's the Human and Social Capital Protocol, those who want full capitals vision. So that's also available. The ISSB is beginning its work, but you don't have to wait for that. You can begin with the NCP and the Social and Human Capital Protocol. Begin here. Start measuring your impacts and start reporting and asking your investees and your borrowers to start reporting you the numbers that you need. Now, I've been in conversation with the TNFD. My company colleagues and I know that this is perfectly possible. We do this for a business. If we didn't, we wouldn't be surviving today. So it is possible. You can do it. Please start now.
Great, thank you so much, Pavan. So it's very much in line as the famous slogan that we all know. Just do it. So that's wonderful. So before handing it over to the next speaker, let me give you a quick recap of the PRB biodiversity community for new joiners. So the PRB biodiversity community, which is quite a mouthful, is a 12-month learning journey for PRB banks who together represent over half of the banking assets. In the first session, we tackled why nature is important for the banking sector. And in the second session, we dove into the business case for nature. Today, we will look at risk through the lens of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures and Opportunities. And after summer, we will continue with a session on impacts and dependencies and key tools. So we hope to see you again after summer. With that said, I want to introduce you to our next speaker. So we're very happy to welcome Annabel Ross, who leads the Banking Environment Initiative at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. The Institute has been a key player in supporting financial institutions in understanding and identifying nature-related financial risks through tools, methodologies, and most notably with the recently published Handbook for Nature-related Financial Risk, which was included in your reading list for today's session. So if you haven't read it yet, you can still do it during summer. So Annabel will provide an overview of why and how nature and biodiversity laws are a material risk for the financial sector and share some concrete examples. So Annabel, we're really glad that you could join us and we're looking forward to your contribution in this session.
Super, thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to scare you by saying since the handbook, we've published 6 new publications. So really drilling down into the use cases and the case for action. So if we move to the next slide and then quickly on to the next one, because we've already heard from Pavan this case. So if we go to the next slide, I'll take you in 10 minutes through a little bit of why nature-related financial risks are material and how you can start to think about them being banks, looking at the processes you have in place already. And here you'll see the history of the work that CISL has done. I'm the Banking Environment Initiative lead. We've worked with 8 banks on this. I see some of the participants on the call today were part of the project with us. We have also worked with the Investment Leaders Group, who are asset managers and owners, to try and bring the financial system to this challenge together. As referenced by Pavan, it needs that collaboration and systems thinking. We've also got an insurance group that have joined us on the project. So when we asked ourselves in 2019, what do financial institutions need to better assess risks? And we listened to the banks that we work with and lots of other initiatives as well. We heard a lot, and actually hearing back to what Homi said at the beginning, common sense tells us that it's really obvious that our economies depend upon nature, that we therefore stick with that. And that slide, please, thank you. And from there, we started to challenge the banks and say, well, if it's common sense, why is it not part of your financial decision-making structure? And we started listening and hearing that actually they needed the business case, the justification, the micro-prudential structure to make this land. So what you've got on the slide now is how we did this journey that started in 2019, and we're still going on it, focused on the risks, and we're about to bring in the opportunities and the engagement with real economy corporates. So today I'm going to focus on the handbook, which is the how. I'm also going to tease out the examples of these from financial institutions, because the use cases that we developed in partnership with the likes of HSBC, NatWest, Robeco showed material devaluation of companies along supply chains, and also downgrades from a credit rating perspective that have material consequences on whole portfolios in certain regions, but also, as we know, on a global structure as well. And then the last publication we've done, which I won't go into too much, but is the case for action. And I'll just highlight a few of the things that we know need to happen now in the banking sector. So if we go to the next slide, I'll quickly run through. It sounds like you've already done a bit of this in the first 2 sessions, but just looking at why and how it flows through the financial system. We've talked about it, ecosystem services drive economic activity, which can create nature loss in a lot of cases. And then you end up with the physical risk and the transition and liability risk. And you're going to hear a lot about some of the structure from me today that feeds really nicely into the TNFD structure, for which we are also a knowledge partner. So nature loss results in this physical risk. To combat nature loss, we see transition risks like policy and regulations start to emerging. But how does this flow through the financial system? And on the next slide, you'll see a diagram from our handbook that looks at where this physical transition and liability nature-related risk, and I'll go into what constitutes these in a bit, flows and impacts companies, it impacts households, it impacts financial institutions, through transmission channels such as disruption of activities that may be caused by physical risks. So a landslide happening that means that operations have to travel in a completely different route, or not at all. Raw material price volatility is another transmission channel, pricing externalities as we start to see those come through the system, stranded assets as a result of some of these risks, as well as capital destruction. So you start to see this impact flow into financial risks, where you've got portfolios that can be wiped out in one catastrophe. There's the feedback possible, and we in our research started looking into that, but actually it's so omnipresent that it is almost unquantifiable. So we acknowledge it and we know that it's hugely important. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see how, especially with climate being a factor of nature-related risk, it starts to play out. So on the next slide, please. Sorry, let me just get back to that. Yeah, thank you. So here is the statement: climate change is only one cause of nature-related risk. You'll see in column A the type of risk, and so those are a list of examples of ecosystem services that are at risk due to climate change being one of these 5 key drivers, invasive species, land use change, over-exploitation of natural resources, and pollution. And these are derived from a range of resources. CISL brought together quite a lot of different parties and research to make this research possible, the likes of DNB, so the Dutch Central Bank's research, broader NGFS work as well, to draw this into a framework that we hope that you as banks will be able to use. And we've proved that it's possible through use cases, which I'll talk you through. Transition risk is another really important element. As we've talked about, policy, regulation, technology, business model transformations, as well as the liability risk, so the litigation and regulation side of things as well. So if we look at risk manifesting as a result of these different factors, you've got air quality loss, food and goods provision loss, habitat intactness and the decline of that, having this material impact on companies. And I've gone through these transmission channels that you see in column C now that lead into the familiar financial risk categories that you know well: credit, market, liquidity, and business risk. So here I'd like you to start to think about how you would like to use this, or how you're able to use it as you are looking at particular transactions, at particular clients, in particular geographies, of how you might map that financial decision making through this framework. And part of this work was possible because of the advancement in climate risk recognition and assessment that has happened. We know there's a lot more to be done there, but here we want you as soon as possible to be able to bring the broader nature-related risks into the consideration, so that the race to zero does incorporate nature, because it is also interrelated. On the penultimate slide, the next slide, I will give you a whistle-stop tour through the use cases. They are 5 different publications, as I mentioned, but have some really material findings. And I'll focus on the first 2 lines. So first of all, one bank and one asset manager from the Banking Environment Initiative and the Investment Leaders Group looked at the vulnerability of degrading land, and in a risk scenario of extreme weather events, what was the difference, both in terms of the on-the-ground presence, but also the financial flow down the value chain to those extreme weather events if you were farming on degraded soil or healthy soil. And in Brazil in particular, some very clear results came out from this scenario use case, and that was that there were devaluations that happened, particularly in smaller packaged foods companies. So not the farmers directly, but actually further down the value chain, of up to 45%. So you start to see devaluations of large scale happen as a result of nature-related financial risks. On the second one, water curtailment risk, this was compiled by HSBC, and I think I saw Maureen join, so she knows this use case well. Here, we created a scenario that looked at a 3-month water stress scenario, similar to what Cape Town went through a few years ago with day 0 and the risk there. This was focused on Southeast Asia and heavy industry, and it looked at what would happen in that water stress scenario. And pretty meaningfully, we saw some material multi-notch downgrades that moved some companies from investment grade into speculative grade. So again, some material information that would make a difference in the way that you deploy capital and hopefully start to engage with corporates. Now on the last, I'll just stay on this slide quickly. On the EU farm to fork strategy, that was a transition risk scenario that looked at what would happen with fertilizer use. So I encourage you, if that's something you're grappling with internally, to head to these use cases. These slides will be shared afterwards, and the icons have the hyperlinks in. But here you start to see exactly how these the financial institutions we partnered with on the use case went about analyzing these risks and driving insights from it, so that you can see some of the people who were involved in the processes. And lastly, Aon, on their nature, they mapped nature risks across a portfolio to start to look at the materiality. So those are all available for you to look at today after the call if you wish. Now on the final slide, this is the penultimate slide. What did we learn? Very similar to Pavan's summary with what he concluded with. Data does exist today to assess some nature-related financial risks. So while we need a lot more data and we want to encourage disclosure from you and from your counterparts, there is enough out there that you can start to start to at least experiment and test out how far you can get, bring teams together. And again, in these use cases, we signpost some of the top resources, and hopefully TNFD will be able to shed some light on that as well. Tools are available. Responses to nature loss can be modeled today with limited specialist guidance. So bringing together the right people, quite a lot of this is common sense. And for those of you familiar with financial risk taking and financial risk decisions, you'll be able to figure it out. So we encourage you to start. Engagement with your corporate clients and other, I mean, the sovereign risk element is very prevalent as well, was something that we saw in the use cases people needed, the banks needed to do to get a little bit more of a feel of what their forward-looking strategy was. So that's what we as CISL are working on now with these financial institutions, is preparing them to be able to talk to clients about this and get action happening in the real economy. And lastly, supply chain transparency as a key barrier to assessing the scale of risks. So that was highlighted as something that needs more data, it needs more openness. So we encourage you to work on that with your partners. I'll conclude very briefly with what we from our research found is now needed. This data element I've just covered, the execution, so looking at company engagement, working out how you can scale the risk assessment. So automation is required because of the amount of data, the type of people, the number of companies in portfolios, and then expertise. So turning up to a program like this is brilliant. You're starting to get familiar with the terms of what's out there. So become familiar with it and try and connect that climate and nature nexus. That's what we're championing completely. Enablers, you've got a lot. We're going to hear from TNFD now. We've got targets, technology, and also moving from risks into opportunities so that we can protect and restore nature. So that is all from me. Sorry it was so brief, but thank you very much for having me, and happy to take questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annabel, for your presentation. I think your work just strikes the perfect balance between, you know, content, practical, it looks very engaging, so it's easy to read. So anybody who is planning their summer holidays and is looking for some reading material, I would say this is where I would start. So with this said, I just want to flag to you that we are using Teams for this session. So if new people join, you hear a little beep. That means that a new person has joined. I think we'll probably afterwards, we'll try to find a way to do it without the beeps next time. But with this said, I would like to introduce you to Nathalie Borgeaud. Nathalie is the Financial Markets Engagement Lead at the TNFD Secretariat. And before you joined TNFD in February of this year only, you worked for a startup promoting data on physical climate risk and nature, among others, by European financial institutions. And before that, you spent a number of years working in the banking sector, working for institutions such as BNP Paribas, JP Morgan, and Citibank. So great to have you on this session, Nathalie. Before I hand over to you, I just want to highlight to our participants that we have the option of asking a question via the chat or sending a message to Walid or myself. So with that said, Nathalie, the floor is yours, and I'm excited to hear about TNFD and its progress.
I am very happy to be here. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be in front of this crowd of my fellow bankers with whom I've worked for many, many years. So I'm going to talk about TNFD, and thank you, Pavan, and thank you, Annabel, for mentioning TNFD. Many of you do know us. Some of you are even part of our task force. What I will do today is do a brief recap of what we're doing, but essentially update you as to our progress, because we're moving really fast here. So TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. What's our goal? Our overall overarching objective is to help shift the flow of global capital from nature negative to nature positive. Why that? Well, to anyone that says, well, are we nature negative today? Well, I will say today, the best science tells us that our ecosystems, their health and condition has already degraded by half. So we're using this nature that's around us, and in fact, we only have half of it available to us already. And we are incredibly dependent on nature. World Economic Forum did a study a couple years back, and they're saying that at least half of our economies are either highly dependent on nature or moderately dependent on nature. So basically, currently, we're having half of our economies, and some argue it's 100% of them, dependent on ecosystems that are already half their size and condition. So for the moment, global capital is not going the right direction. It needs to be redirected. So that's why we're having TNFD here. And what we're developing and delivering is a risk management and disclosure framework to report and act and help make this shift. TNFD is really 34 task force members, some of you are in this group, that are holding the pen and drafting that framework. We are supported by, today, over 500 institutions that have joined our forum. And I would call for you, if you're not part of our forum, please become a forum member. There you'll have all the information on what we're doing and plenty on where to go, what to do if you want to tackle that issue of taking decisions that take into account nature and how to proceed. We have 16 knowledge partners that help us navigate through the science, through the standards. And I have to name here, obviously, UNEP-5, who is one of our founding partner. That is also a knowledge partner, and that is also today helping us gathering pilots of financial institutions that are already trying on piloting our framework. And I'll talk about that later on in 5 minutes. Our framework is already out. We had a first version out in March. Since then, we've had over 30,000 views of the framework and plenty of LinkedIn followers, almost just as much as TCFD, which is another way to look at how people are looking at our work. So what's our work? Our work are disclosure recommendations. We want them to be completely aligned with TCFD so that you do not have to recreate the wheel when you disclose. It is the same approach, and I'll go into that a little bit later on. We have provided some guidance. Our guidance we call LEAP, for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. The locate part is incredibly important. Just like for physical climate risk, where the companies you invest in, where they're located, where their process is located, is important to their impact on nature and to their dependency on nature. If it's located in a place where there's a lack of water, problem. If they're located in a place where they're drawing on land through deforestation, it's a problem. We have on this how to guidance, we have just released, and we've had a new release in June of our framework with additions to it. We've added some particular guidance for financial institutions, and I would recommend you take a look at it. We call that LEAP FI, which explains how financial institutions and banks can start going about using our framework and the particularities of dealing with, not like corporates that have a number of operations, but as a financial institutions, what you deal with are portfolios of many, many different assets. It can be thousands of assets in the case of asset managers. It could be millions of loans or dozens of millions of loans for financial institutions. And looking at that makes a huge difference in terms of portfolios and looking at how you prioritize that is important. We also are looking to provide nature risk scenarios. We're working on it. We're working on it together with the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, this network of central banks, of over 100 central banks. We are working on, we've developed a paper on metrics, a paper on data, and we obviously are keen to have core concepts and definitions being the same language that everybody can use, and making sure these are the same that other science partners are giving us. On alignment with TCFD, and I'm on slide 5 here, you will recognize the 4 pillars of TCFD with governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. We're using the same approach. And the things that are different, well, are obvious difference. Our scenarios are not climate scenarios, they're nature scenarios. We have a huge focus on location, as I mentioned. And when we look at metrics, at value chain, at targets, those are related to nature, not climate, but the approach is the same. On slide 6, it is important to us that when you look at your portfolio, either your portfolio of loans, portfolio of assets, there is a good understanding of, for each asset, what are the impacts on nature and what are the dependencies on nature. Those two things are sort of the pillar of the understanding of who you lend to, who you invest in, or who you insure if you're in insurance. From that understanding, you can build and deliver an understanding on the risks that you bear and the opportunities that you might have, and in these companies you're lending to or investing in. Just a quick thing on metrics, and I'm on slide 7. In the paper that we released in the last in our last release, just end of June, a couple of weeks ago, we have particularly focused, well, we're first delivering an architecture of metrics. What we are targeting for November, we will have an approach on the metrics related to risk and opportunities and linked to enterprise value. What we're doing at this point is encouraging each of you to go and pilot our framework. And I'm on slide 8 here. Well, the first thing you can do is go and have a look at the framework, make your comments, just consult and comment. We've had comments in the very first version, which we've taken into account to produce the next release. And we've had plenty of substantial comments. In fact, we've had over 500 of very substantive comments from experts of the market. I was the one looking at all these comments, so I can tell you they were very expert comments. This is not finished. You have until June of next year to come up with your comments on our framework. We're on an innovation process, and all of your comments are welcome anytime between now and June, and we'll try to take them into account as we go and we progress. We have for targets to produce the final version of our framework by September 2023. So a little over a year from now, and we're giving us that full year from now until June next year for you to come back and comment. The other thing you can do is join our forum membership, where you will be able to hear the webinars that explain a number of things. We've had a webinar on regulation with the presence of the Banque de France, the DNB. We've had another webinar on the new kind of data that exists today, satellite data, eDNA type data, etc. So we are trying to provide you with what's the best information that you can get today on all those topics that are meaningful to you. The third thing you can do is, once you've done all of the first two, the last thing you can do is actually pilot the framework and go see on a piece of your assets how you would disclose what a TNFD report would look like for a piece of your balance sheet. This is something that you can do either completely independently, or you can join UNEP-FI on the specific pilots that are being developed together with UNEP-FI. Or sometimes a few institutions are joining service providers such as the accountants or consulting firms that gather little groups of institutions and help them do piloting together. But please go and do pilot our framework. Come back to us and tell us what you think. We highly value your input. And with this, I'll give you back the floor, Romy.
Thank you so much, Nathalie, for your interesting presentation and really your deep dive into the TNFD beta framework. Sometimes when we speak to organizations about the development of the beta framework, we make a joke and we say, there's 3 things to remember when you look at the beta framework, and it's location, 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 right? So it has a very strong emphasis on the location element. That's important. And again, whenever I visit the TNFD website, it's very rich in content. The layout is wonderful. So we do encourage everyone to join the forum if you haven't done so already, and to go to the TNFD website, create a profile. And of course, when you're very interested, you can test the TNFD framework. So before we move on to the panel, I want to turn to Vivek Menon, who is an old friend from my IUCN days. And what we often notice in sessions that are about nature and biodiversity, that nature is on the agenda, but again, it's not spoken about nature so much. So literally, it continues to be the elephant in the room. And as nature cannot speak for itself, I'm really happy to invite Vivek Menon to speak on its behalf. As I said earlier, Vivek is the Executive Director of the Wildlife Trust of India, and you have over 30+ years of experience in nature and conservation. You are a serial entrepreneur and you've led over 5 NGOs over the past years. You are a senior advisor to the CEO of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. You are an elected counselor to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and you are a chair of its Asian Elephant Specialist Group. So it's quite a lot. In addition, you are an environmental commentator, author, photographer, and you have a passion for elephants, as we can all see based on the picture behind you. So, Vivek, what does nature like to say to all of us?
Thank you, Rumi, and thank you, Walid, for inviting me to this forum. As you asked me to be the energizing talker in between, I presume you meant that the speakers ahead of me were not, but I was extremely energized by hearing all three of them, my friend Pavan and the two ladies with great knowledge of the banking sector. Friends, as Rumi so wonderfully said, the elephant in the room. Let's talk about nature. Even when people put up those wonderful graphs that some of you did, nature is in a box in a column with arrows running out of it, right? But nature is the matrix in which we are all embedded, whether it's corporation, whether it's me, whether it's you, whether it's the elephant. So let me talk about this animal, and I'll come at the end of this very short talk on how this is relevant to you as bankers. But the elephant first. What is it? I've been given less than 10 minutes to talk about a 3.5 million year old animal. Okay? In all our knowledge of nature, when I went to school 45 years ago, I was told that there are two species of elephant, the Asian and the African. Now we know that there are two African elephants, and now the Asian Elephant Specialist Group is preparing to see whether there are two Asian elephants. Okay, so, but if we take the Asian elephant as one even now, this is an animal that evolved, you may be surprised to know, before the African elephant in Africa, in the papyrus swamps of Egypt, and was pushed out by the evolution of Loxodonta, the African elephant, into Europe as the mammoth, into America as the mastodon, and eventually via Central Asia and China comes into the country that I was born in, India, about 1.5 million years ago. So those of you bankers who are from India, please remember this is the original Adivasi, something that has come about more than 1.5 million years ago, a traditional liver of this country. Now, whether I talk to you bankers or heads of nations or little children, and if I'm asked to explain an elephant in 4 words, it is big, which even a child tells you. It's intelligent, in fact, so intelligent that it's a near person, according to me, much more intelligent than most of my close friends. Social, and social in a very dramatic manner. It's a matriarchal being, like me. I come from the state of Kerala, so I'm a matriarchal clan of mine. The elephants are also matriarchal. And it's a nomad. All 4 words are increasingly important for you to know for the reasons I'm just about to expound, which is that the elephant, this Asian elephant, of which, by the way, which for all of you to know, there are only 50,000 left in this world, as compared to nearly 500,000 African elephants. So whenever you hear of the fact that the African elephant is plummeting through a catastrophic decline, remember there are only 50,000 Asian elephants left. Now this animal being big in biology, we call it a mega herbivore, which means weighs over 1,000 kilos and has to eat that much to sustain this large body weight that you see behind me. As a result, nature has constructed this being in a manner that it has to move. It has to be a nomad. You cannot settle an elephant. If you try to settle an elephant, like some of my colleagues and friends in Southern Africa have tried to, what happens is that an elephant will eat itself out of the forest or savanna or wherever the natural resources that it has. And as a result, you may have the question of whether we have too many elephants. In India, what we do is we do not enclose them and instead allow them to roam. Now, is this a good thing? It is definitely a good thing for elephants. However, increasingly, the elephant pathways that they've used to move between 2 sources, when food runs out from one place, climatically they move. These pathways are the pathways that we have taken over for living in and for all developmental measures. When the British built the first roads in the foothills of the Himalayas, you know, one of the fundamental principles they used? To find areas of stability, to to build the roads, they used elephant footpaths. They were intelligent people. They realized that the elephant would not trod on soil that was unstable. So they used elephant footpaths. Unfortunately for the elephants, they had to shift that footpath, right? So as these pathways of local migration and movement of elephants started getting cut down, what we are faced with increasingly in Asia, particularly in India and Sri Lanka, is large number of conflicts. So when we talk of conserving elephants, most people think of ivory trade and killing of elephants and poaching. And when I was a young man, I also thought of it. I, in fact, went undercover for 1.5 years to try and crack the ivory trade in Japan and China, many, many years ago. But as you looked at the elephant paradigm and as you look at it today, the thing that faces the greatest threat to the elephant is that loss of ability to move. The Wildlife Trust of India, the Government of India, we've been trying to do a project called Right of Passage, not of ownership, but just to allow these elephants to move from one place to the other. 17 years ago, we produced a book called Right of Passage, in which we actually put down the 88 little corridors that link all these vast elephant habitats that once were, which were now patchy, fragmented forests throughout India. 10 years later, when we redid the book, we had 101 corridors and everybody was happy. Oh, so we have more corridors. No, we should be unhappy because we have more corridors because more of habitat has been fragmented. By what, my friends? By roads, railways, irrigation canals, linear infrastructure. And today, linear infrastructure, which all of you, or many of you, must be financing or thinking of financing, is perhaps the single most important hurdle in the face of the elephant. This is not, as we have heard from some of the previous speakers, a risk to your enterprise because of raw material or because of passage of your products. This is simple collateral damage. While business is being done without considering, you will annihilate a species that has been with us in our parts of the world as a heritage cultural icon, even more than just a natural icon, but definitely the second largest living land animal in this world. It needs space. And if this space cannot be provided by intelligently planning underpasses or overpasses, and there are several such mechanisms that we have in place, and if all of you do not follow the 3 previous speakers and ensure that that capital that is today elephant negative does not turn elephant positive by your wise investments, then this animal will no longer be with us. Friends, I invite you to the wilds of India at any stage with me or my colleagues to see a wild elephant. Till you do that, try to protect it from wherever you are with the financial capital mechanisms that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vivek. And it was so inspirational to, take us in your world of conserving and protecting nature. And I've had the privilege to visit some of the projects you set up in the past. So I think if people are interested to learn more about you and your work that you're doing, which is amazing, thank you so much. And I think with this said, we want to move to the last component of our busy agenda, which is our panel. So we have 3 wonderful panelists that are joining us. So we have Judson, Cristiano, and Nehru. So if I may ask you to unmute yourself and turn your camera on. Thank you so much. So I would like to start with you, Judson. You're currently Managing Director and Group Head of Sustainability Regulatory Strategy at UBS, a bank you joined nearly 20 years ago and in which you held many senior roles, most lately as the title I mentioned earlier. You are also one of the very privileged task force members that are leading the work as a market-led initiative of the TNFD, alongside your co-panelist, Cristiano, and also Nehru, who I think we can't see yet, or at least I cannot see yet. So Judson, I want to start with you with a simple question, which is, why did UBS decide to join the TNFD as a task force member? I know when we were selecting the members, we had a requirement of you to spend at least, I think, 2 days of your month on the TNFD, which is quite a heavy commitment for senior people from your organization. So why did you join as a task force member? May I ask you?
Thanks, Rami. Thanks for inviting us to this webinar. And I'm very privileged to be a part of the task force and work with people like Nathalie on the task force, probably a bit more than 2 days a month. I wish I could do it all of my month, but unfortunately, I don't have that choice. I want to harken back to what Pavan started us with, which is we at UBS believe we are in this transition to a new, not just financial system, to a new economy, an impact economy, an economy that lives within a set of planetary boundaries. And so for us, this is part of being in that transitionary process, supporting that process. And essentially, it's harkening back to our roots. It's harkening back to every bank's roots. I mean, banks are there to finance the needs of their society of the time in which they are in. UBS was founded in, as many of our peers, Deutsche Bank, which Pavan mentioned, Citibank, other HSBC, others. We were founded in the Industrial Revolution as economies were fundamentally changing their nature. And that's essentially how we see it today. You were part of that transitionary process now, really moving into this new economic state and living within these planetary boundaries. So part of that is about getting good information. Transparency can be part of transforming. So we absolutely believe that getting good information base out into the markets can be critical to ensuring that good decisions are made so we can be net nature elephant positive, as we just heard, net nature positive overall. So having that information base out, we think, is critical. And so getting the standards in place, as UBS, we're very supporters of international standards, collaborative efforts as part of our DNA as a Swiss bank. So we absolutely think that doing this at the level of a global standard is the right way to do this. We had that experience with TCFD. We were original member of TCFD, and we saw the power of that and how that's really shifted things in the past years. It took a little bit longer than maybe one would have hoped, but now there's a very rich conversation going on about transition, targets of net zero, interim targets, and really sort of asking companies to fundamentally disclose how they are evolving their business strategies to hit policy objectives. So if we can recreate that dynamic on nature, we think that will be very, very powerful, not just for us, for our clients, for the markets, but ultimately for society. We think that would be part of really driving out this transition. So we're very excited and privileged to be a part of helping define some of those rules and really taking forward this process to lead to this fundamental transition that we're in right now.
Super. Thank you so much, Judson. And I think just to summarize it, how can indeed better information lead to better decision making? So I want to turn to our second speaker, Cristiano, and he's been on a different webinar we organized, and he did so well that we thought it was so important to invite him again to have that corporate voice. So as UNIPFI, we of course speak mostly to financial institutions, but financial institutions invest into corporations, right? So we need to create that connection more and more. So you are currently Sustainability Executive Manager at Suzano, which is the largest pulp and paper company in Latin America. And in your role, you're responsible for the development and the management of the company's sustainability strategy and really for internalizing sustainability within the processes and relationships with your stakeholders. You are also one of the 34 task force members. And I want to actually start with you with the same question we already asked Judson. Why did you as a person, but also Suzano joined the TNFD task force? And what have you learned since then from the group?
Thanks, Rami. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to represent the corporate perspective on such an essential debate. So it really is, like Judson said, a privilege to be part of the 34-strong group. The reason why we decided to take part in TNFD is because of our essence. We're a natural capital company. We're a Brazilian forest company producing pulp. We're the global leader in market pulp. And we felt that, just stepping aside and not being part of this conversation would go against what we believe is the future of business, all business, and the essence of our business model already today and over the past 5 decades. So we were a stakeholder, and we felt that having an active voice in this conversation was much needed. I do want to highlight, though, having said that, again, lucky to be part of the 34, but as Nathalie mentioned, this is an open innovation process. And I think one hugely important aspect of TNFD, and I think something that provides a lot of insight for other multi-stakeholder processes, is how engaged the TNFD, how open it is to different perspectives. And when you're talking about something as new as this, when you're talking about something as important as this, bringing in different perspectives is absolutely crucial. So for us, being a part of it is essential. And I think one other thing that I wanted to highlight is how nature and biodiversity is not disassociated from other crises that we're currently going through as society and that as business we face. So to talk about biodiversity loss crisis is also to talk about the climate crisis, and it's also to talk about the inequality and poverty crisis, which is unfortunately particularly acute in places like Brazil. So it's an opportunity to have a systems perspective on this thing and being part of that conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cristiano. And I think it's really beautiful that you started with that. It's ultimately about practice what you preach. And that's the reason for you as an organization to join the TNFD. And within UNEP, we speak about the triple crisis of nature, climate, and pollution. But I think the social element there is so important because we know that those are the most vulnerable, are hit hardest with all of these crises. So that's important for us to keep in mind in all the work we developed. I wish that I could turn to our third speaker now, Nehru, who is based in South Africa and who has some problems joining the call at the moment because I know that there is some electricity issues. So before we do so, I would want to come back to you, Judson, to ask you, UBS is a task force member, and I think we're all on a collective learning journey into, understanding really, again, going back maybe to Pavan's work, measuring your impact on nature, managing it, and based on that, improving it. So if you look at UBS's journey, where are you currently, and what are your next steps or challenges that you're working on?
Thanks for the question. We are on that journey, clearly, as I think all of us are. We did put out a statement on nature earlier this year. It's qualitative, so I'll be very clear that we've not done heavy quantification on nature and biodiversity yet. There's lots of interesting methodologies out there, lots of interesting data out there. Nothing that we're comfortable yet publicly disclosing, but certainly we're starting to do some research on that. I guess one of the learnings I've had since being part of the task force is how complicated this can be, particularly compared to climate. You don't have that single unit of measure. You don't have the policy objective yet, for net zero to develop your transition pathway. But the thing that's given me comfort and reassurance is also learning how much is being done already and all the great thinking and innovation that's going in. Lots of data sets that are out there that are being made more accessible, more transparent. Data providers trying to step in the middle, to support the financial sector. Lots of great work being done on different methodologies that are being innovated. So I think there's lots to build on, which is part of what we're trying to do within UBS now is to really get our hands dirty, get our feet wet, so to speak, and really start to make progress on our further understanding. But I don't think anyone is necessarily starting from zero. I don't think we're starting from zero at UBS. I think about sort of where we've come from over the years. In 2011, we put in place the first detailed lending standards on various nature topics, forestry, soy, agriculture, palm oil. And admittedly, those are qualitative standards, but that's been now embedded into our lending process. So anytime we onboard a new client, anytime there's a new transaction, that needs to go through a dedicated review process. And if there are red flags, that gets flagged up, just like with anti-money laundering, for example. So it's the same process. It's built into that process, and that then goes to the specialists, sustainability and climate risk team, who then do the enhanced due diligence. You have to really think about whether that's a transaction that we want to do, whether that's a client that we want to do. And we've seen that really play out in positives and negatives. Just to give a couple examples, from recent years, we had a client who we, in the palm oil sector, we wanted them to be formally a member of the responsible RSPO, the roundtable on sustainable palm oil. We gave them a bit of a grace period to get there. They didn't, so we exited that client. So these standards have, real teeth to them. But on a more other end of the spectrum, we had a similar case related to soy, where we wanted that client really to enter more into some of the existing soy standards. They were willing to help them through that process. They did get there, and that's a relationship that continues to this day. So I think a lot of us are managing some of these risks, maybe a bit more qualitatively, and what we're trying to get to is more the quantified version of some of these things, and ultimately being able to disclose more systematically on risks and opportunities, the impacts and dependencies within our portfolios. So that's something that we will all work on, but I think it's great that within UNEP, you've started this community. I think it's a chance for all of us to learn together, to work together. TNFD is really trying to crowd in a lot of these collaborative efforts and work with them. So I'm really pleased by all the energy that's coming to the table. And I think the only challenge, or one of the main challenges we face, is only 24 hours in a day, and really trying to get the ability to work on this more and get the time and attention of the experts in the bank. But I would say probably all of our institutions have things to build on. So start from where you are and progress from there.
Great, thank you so much. And I agree with you. I think I've been working in this space for a while, and I think it's been an uphill climb often to get attention for the topic of nature within financial institutions. And now it seems like we're sliding down, right? And there's so many things happening that it's nearly impossible to keep track. So with that said, I want to turn to Nehru. Nehru, I've explained to the group that you had some issues joining the call. So thank you for your your continued tries to join this call, and also a big thanks to Walid, who's helping you in the background. So you are General Manager Research and Intelligence at Land and Agricultural Development Bank of South Africa. You led the bank's strategies, developments on sustainability and development impact, and you were also part of the core group of 30 banks that developed the PRB back in 2018 and 2019. So Nehru, one of the reasons we invited you to join this call is that you are a bank that has been using the Encore tool, which is a tool that is designed to help banks to identify nature-related risk, opportunities, and exposure in your activities by setting out how each industry and sub-industry depends and impacts nature. So I want to learn from you partly, what you did, but firstly, I would like you to touch on, why did you use Encore? So what was the internal process? And then if you've spoken about that, maybe you can also explain to the group what you have done, because I think it's been such an exciting process that you have done. So thank you, Nehru, for joining us.
Thanks, Romy. My apologies for all the challenges at the beginning. Yeah, so if you go back, look, the land bank is we finance primary agriculture. So that's our entire portfolio is located in primary agriculture mainly. So going back a few years, I think there was a bit of a realization that everything we do depends on nature and the services that nature provides. So all our entire loan portfolio is dependent on natural assets. So this was about maybe 5-6 years ago. Obviously, we started a new journey from that point to the point of joining the PRB in terms of its development, committing to the principles, and then flowing from that was a few years of drought in South Africa, and then an obvious problem arising within our maize production part of our portfolio in a specific province of South Africa. So we wanted to understand why was this happening. So what are the real challenges that we're facing, what are the risks, what are the dependencies. So, I mean, it just seemed at the same time that the Natural Capital Finance Alliance started, engaging with us, and it was a good collaboration then to work on the application of the ANCOR tool, fundamentally to understand what are those material ecosystem services, specific to the maize production in that location. What are the key dependencies in terms of these services, and what are the drivers of environmental change that can disrupt these ecosystem services? And obviously from that, it's all about how do we start managing these risks and opportunities that arise. So it was a very interesting exercise. Obviously, what we did was we just located one portion of our entire portfolio. And then what we did was we did a rapid natural capital risk appraisal, which is part of the ANCOR tool. And then it became more interesting after that, because then it started, there's the new things that we started to have to think about that came out from the research, issues around soil quality, climate regulation, water flow, floods and storms, and then from that flow the issues around the risks that and what are these disruptions to or environmental changes that are causing some of our challenges, like habitat modification, the storms, the droughts, pollution, surface and groundwater pollution. So all of this provided us with a little bit more insight from the time we started, and that was the reason. We wanted more depth to understand what is the dependencies, what are the nature-related risks that specifically that part of the portfolio. Obviously, the next step for us now would be to start extending this to our entire portfolio for the different high-risk commodities. So that is what we'd be moving towards. I mean, it just sort of came at the right time in terms of how do we start thinking about impact and targets and identification of risks and assessment and measurement and disclosure. And then at the same time, we had this engagement with Thomas from the NCFA. So we've got a very good first assessment. And I think the key from the first assessment is that there's still lots of work to be done.
Great, wonderful, Nehru. And before I turn to you with a final question, I want to turn back to Chris, because we've spoken about earlier about the fact that Suzano tries to really internalize sustainability within all components of your operations. But you've told me, when you speak to investors, they rarely ask you questions about this. So can you speak a bit more to Suzano's work on nature, and what are the questions you want investors to ask you on the work that you're doing?
Yeah, and that's funny, right? That the fact that we're a natural capital business, and yet most of the ESG questions are related to climate, community engagement, and other topics that, of course, are also material. But biodiversity seems to be forgotten, and we've noticed a change in this because of TNFD. I think 2-3 years ago, very few investors would ask biodiversity and nature-related questions, and when they'd ask it, it would be just the obvious one. What are the processes that you have in place to ensure your zero deforestation commitment? And nowadays, the questions that we're starting to get are much more sophisticated. And it's funny because, a lot of our assets, a lot of our business model is biodiversity positive and benefits from increase in biodiversity. So we have a mosaics pattern landscape planning, which means we plant eucalyptus, which is used for commercial purposes, that becomes pulp, that becomes paper and other products, increasingly actually other products that will substitute non-renewables. And we do this, we plant it side by side with areas set aside for conservation. Actually 40% of our areas are set aside for conservation in 3 important biomes in Brazil: the Amazon, the Brazilian savanna, also known as the Cerrado, and the Atlantic rainforest. And we understand that by doing this, this is good for our business because that interspersion in the landscape decreases the incidence of plagues and diseases. So it's not like, oh, biodiversity is something to the side of business and nature is to the side of business. Actually, it makes business sense for us to be nature positive. And so to answer your other specific question, Rami, about what we'd like investors to ask, what we feel would be good questions, I think TNFD already gives the tips, right, in the framework and the beta of the TNFD. So and Judson and Pavan mentioned this already. It's about getting to the connection between nature and business. So one really easy question to be asked is, and it makes sense for a forest company, but it makes sense for any company, which is, in what ways does your business impact on nature? And the other is, what are the dependencies that you have of your business model and on nature, and what are the ways that you're exploring to mitigate risk, and I think crucially increase opportunities. And whenever there's a dollar sign, whenever you can get to the valuation, that's great. But generally, even making these qualitative connections, that's a really important first step. So both for investors on the one side, I think, for them to start including this in their models and in decision making, but also asking the question helps business realize the importance of looking at nature, the importance of valuing nature, the importance of making the connection that is there in practice and in reality, but sometimes for businesses, it doesn't yet happen. And again, I think TNFD's accelerated this, will be a catalyst for this, I have no doubt, but it's necessary for engagement. We're talking about investors, but also obviously banks, to start including these questions and these aspects into their conversations with corporates.
Wonderful, that's great, and I think it also alludes to what Judson said. It's both qualitative and quantitative, and we need to have that mix now. And what I find interesting is that we're all on this shared learning journey. So as financial institutions, but I also had the privilege last week to join a few sessions organized by the World Business Council, where we had similar discussions about, what should investors ask businesses. So I think we're all kind of speeding up along the same lines. So as promised, Nehru, I wanted to come back to you if you can speak maybe for 1 or 2 minutes, because you're one of the organizations joining the UNEP-FI-led pilot program of the TNFD. So can you tell me, why did you decide to join that, and what do you expect to get out of the pilot process before we move on to the wrap up?
Okay, thanks, Rami. As I said earlier, we started this journey a few years ago, specifically on the natural capital assets and the risks associated with started maybe in 2019. So it seemed like, based on the output of this first bit of research, that the natural next step would be to then follow through on the TNFD. So we were very keen to then pilot this as a sort of natural progression. It's it's something that you need to start, and no matter where you are, you start learning along the journey, and that's where we are. That's why we've decided to go along.
Wonderful, great. So with this said, we're coming to the end of this session, and being Dutch, I get a bit stressed that we only have 3 minutes more. So I wanted to say a big thank you to all of our speakers. So I think we had a wonderful global perspective. We had people from different industries and really from different skill sets. So thank you all. We will be sharing the recording deck and also the slides you have seen with the key resources that we have mentioned today. So as the British like to say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So if you got excited by this session and you're interested to start testing the TNFD draft framework, as was explained so eloquently by Nathalie, please reach out to Walid or myself. I think our contact details are on the last slide, because we embarked on the journey of having not 1, but 6 pilots in support of the TNFD, in which we're really looking into different geographies, different sectors, and also different realms. So I think this is a very exciting process, but it's never too late to still onboard. So if you're interested, please reach out to me or Walid. Lastly, I wanted to mention to all of you that we would love to see you back after summer. So mid-September, we will be inviting you to a session on portfolio impact and dependency. So you'll receive an invitation to that about 3 weeks ahead of the meeting. And, you know, if you enjoyed this session, why don't you invite your colleagues to join next time? So we have a bigger group and we have a bigger learning community, so we can have a bigger impact on the nature we all try to protect. So with that said, I want to say a big thank you to our speakers once more. And I'm really glad to see we still have 1 minute. So if you have another meeting started, feel free to go there. I want to thank you for your attention and see you back after summer. Take care.